Hello everyone, my name is Ben, a 3D specialist with Chaos Group, and welcome to bringing quality and speed to your rendering with V-Ray 3 for Sketchup. First off, a little bit about myself. I'm a 3D artist and AE specialist with Chaos Group. I have a master's degree in architecture and about 5 years in the AEC industry. And if you'd like to reach me directly, feel free to email me at ben.hurlbut@chaosgroup.com. A quick overview of what we're going to cover, which includes a brief look at our design philosophy behind V-Ray for SketchUp's new interface. We will then go over the major features of V-Ray for SketchUp with demonstrations using a small collection of architectural scenes. So there's essentially two types of artists who create visualizations. There's the designer and the visualization expert. The designer treats the rendering as essentially one tool among many in a large toolkit. While visualization is important, it is not the primary focus, while the visualization expert is a specialist whose primary role is to produce high-quality imagery. The visualization is the primary focus and the final result. So V-Ray for SketchUp's new interface was designed with designers in mind, while still having the power of the extensive set of V-Ray features available for advanced users. By default, it is easy to pick up and use to achieve high-quality imagery. This allows you to spend less time fiddling with the tool and more time on what really matters, your design. This is all without sacrificing the expanded tool set for visualization experts to tinker and tweak to your heart's content. So ultimately, it comes down to V-Ray for SketchUp being easy, powerful, and fast. This leads us to the new interface. Everything you need is right at your fingertips, while the more detailed features can easily be accessed with the rollouts and expanded areas of the interface. So let's take a quick look at the new interface. There's going to be three new toolbars. There's the main toolbar, which has the asset editor, render buttons, the show frame buffer buttons, which the frame buffer is the V-Ray rendering button. Rendering window, and then we also have the lights toolbar and the geometry toolbar. And I'm going to go ahead and open the asset editor, which is basically the nerve center of V-Ray for SketchUp. It has four main tabs: materials, lights, geometry, and settings. And then there's also a duplicate render button and show frame buffer button at the top right. And then there's also an expandable right panel, which has more advanced settings for each of the tabs. And then for materials, there's also an expandable left panel, which has the V-Ray for SketchUp material library. V-Ray is a very flexible rendering engine that allows you to easily switch between modes depending on what stage of the design and visualization process you're in. Interactive rendering is available, so changes you make to your scene update in the rendering without having to stop and start the process yourself. The production rendering is best used to achieve your final results. And V-Ray uses your computer's CPU by default, but it can also utilize GPU hardware as well, which can be many times faster depending on what kind of hardware you're working with. So as you can see, it's easy to switch between the different modes in the settings tab of the asset editor. And when interactive is disabled, you have a quality slider available which adjusts the quality of your final rendering. So essentially deactivating interactive is for production final imagery. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and start an interactive rendering. I'm going to check the render output, and the default's fine, so I'm not going to change it. And then I'm going to enable material overrides. And material overrides allow you to override all the materials in your scene with either a color or a material. So right now interactive rendering is going, so as I make changes and move the camera, you'll notice it updates in real time in the frame buffer. And again, the frame buffer is the rendering window for V-Ray for SketchUp. I'm going to disable this and I'm going to enable GPU rendering. And sometimes with GPU rendering, if you update your drivers or install a new version of V-Ray, it takes a second to get started because it has to recompile some of the CUDA drivers. And just like with CPU, as I move the camera, you notice it's updating in real time. I'm going to go ahead and stop the rendering, and we'll disable interactive and GPU acceleration so we can do kind of a more of a finalized production render. Now with production rendering, you have more options with global illumination. You typically don't have to mess with these, but they're available to modify. And global illumination is more it's what algorithms are used to calculate your secondary light bounces. And I'm going to disable material overrides, and I also disabled progressive, so this will actually use buckets instead of progressive. And buckets means that it will render small chunks of the image to completion, which is usually what you want to use in when you're doing final renders. So you'll notice it's not doing the whole rendering at once, it's just these small buckets. You'll also notice you can expand the ray trace settings to really customize the rendering, but the quality slider is essentially all you need, and you also notice that as you adjust the quality slider, it changes all the settings for you. So it also helps you kind of train yourself to understand just exactly what's changing, just in case you wanted to do some fine tweaks. So I'm going to do an even higher quality version of this. I'm going to use high quality, and I'm going to use a final resolution. I'm going to use HD 1920 by 1080. And then I'm also going to enable Swarm. And Swarm is our new intelligent distributive rendering solution. Essentially, there's a slider that you can change just how many systems on your network that you want to use at once based on a percentage. And I'll go ahead and start the rendering, and I'll show you just how you can do that. You can modify this while the rendering is going. So right now the slider is all the way to the right, and it wants to use 100% of the available nodes on the network. But if I move the slider down, it will now try to use 39% of the available machines, and now 21%. Or if I move it all the way back to 100, it will try to use every single swarm node available on the network. So you notice there's more buckets in the rendering now. That's because those are additional machines that are jumping in and assisting with the rendering. And at this point, I actually sped it up a little bit. It took about 6.5 minutes to finish this rendering, but I didn't think we'd want to wait 6.5 minutes for this to finish. All right. So camera controls are very easy to use in V-Ray for Sketchup. From previous versions, we wanted to make camera features such as exposure and depth of field more accessible to all users. We also added the ability to easily create images for interactive panoramas or VR renderings. And I already have interactive rendering going, and I'll show you how easy it is to make camera changes, such as the exposure. As I modify the exposure value, it'll update in real time. Same with white balance. It's modifying the color and white balance will modify the image. So if I use a cooler color, it'll make the image warmer, and vice versa. There's also a little button next to next to standard camera, which will allow us to modify the settings as though this were a real camera for the photographers out there. But by default, it's just using simple exposure values. Then depth of field is a lot easier to use in version 3. You just simply modify the defocus amount to change just how blurry the image will get. And then it's easy to either enter a focus distance, or if you use the pick focal point tool, you can just select the little point. You'll notice it's now focusing on that corner of the building. And then under effects, we also have vignetting and vertical tilt controls. And then we also have different camera types available for doing panoramas and VR renderings, the spherical panorama and the VR cube map. This is good for a panorama, but if you disable interactive, you have the ability to enable stereoscopic, which allows you to do a 3D rendering for a VR headset. So I'm going to go ahead and move the view down to street level. And you'll also notice in the render output, as I switch this to the cube map, for example, the aspect ratio will actually update to the proper aspect ratio. Now with the cube map, this is a standard format that, for example, most VR headsets, all the major ones, and panorama viewers use, where essentially it creates a cube, six-sided cube of wherever the camera is. And then since this is stereoscopic, it's creating two cubes, one for each eye, so then you'll end up with 12 squares, essentially. So you can take this and do something like this. This is an example of something I rendered earlier using a panorama viewer. This was a free one called SView that I found, where you can just simply load in an image, pan around. But you can also do this in 3D using a VR headset. And I highly recommend going to Chaos Group Labs. I believe it's labs.chaosgroup.com, where you can find a neat little guide that tells you the best formats to use for each headset and good ways to get things into, like, let's say, a Google Cardboard. Moving on to environment, V-Ray for Sketchup uses the sun settings from Sketchup to generate its physically correct sun and sky in conjunction with the physical camera built-in V-Ray Aerial perspective is an atmospheric effect, which is new to V-Ray for Sketchup 3, which is used to create haze and fog in V-Ray for Sketchup. So I'm going to start an interactive rendering. I'll show you how integrated we are with SketchUp Sun and Sky system. All you need to do is just adjust the date and time, just like you would in SketchUp, and V-Ray will get that information. And you'll also see, if I enable the shadow settings in SketchUp, that the sun location is in the same spot. So the shadows in SketchUp will be the same as the shadows in V-Ray. And now to tweak the settings, if you go to the light section of the asset editor, the sun is listed, and this is where you can change all the settings for the sun and sky in V-Ray. Like the intensity multiplier, which will modify just how bright the sun is. There's the size multiplier, which is what you use to adjust the softness of the shadows. A size of 2 or 3 is usually good for realism, but like if you set the size to 1, you'll notice super sharp shadows. If I use a higher setting like 12, you'll notice the shadows are much softer. Then another useful setting is the ground albedo color. This is the color of the sky as it reaches the horizon. So if I use something a little more dramatic like orange, you'll notice it changing in the background. So like it's the gray by default, which is kind of imitating a smoggy kind of atmosphere, but you can change it to something like, let's use a kind of a dull dark blue to create a nicer effect. And so moving on to aerial perspective, this is located under the settings and environment, and it's already enabled in this scene, but I can show you what you can do with it. So if I wanted to make the scene much foggier, all you would need to do is just set the visibility range to something much closer. So instead of 6,000 meters, we'll change this to 100 meters. You'll notice it'll update. You can also adjust the atmospheric height. If you adjust this too low, like I'm adjusting it to just below the camera, you can get some strange effects. So, but you can also create some cool things like, say, fog in a valley, etc. And then there's also the effect environment and effect background toggles at the bottom. These, if you're using aerial perspective to create a fog effect, you typically want to have these enabled. But if you're trying to create actual aerial perspective, which is the effect of objects in the distance becoming hazier, which you'll notice is something on a clear day, is you'll notice it a lot more, especially in a city like New York, for example. You typically want to have effect environment and background disabled, as the sky actually already has a haze built into it. Right, lighting. V-Ray for SketchUp has a wide assortment of features available for lighting your scene besides using just the sun. For example, you can encompass the entire scene using an image with the dome light. There's a variety of simple light shapes available to insert into your scene, including planes, spheres, and the Omni light. Spotlights are available to create physically accurate area lights. You can convert SketchUp groups or components into mesh lights. And with the IES light, you can use IES files, such as those from lighting manufacturers, to light your scene. Finally, we have the light list in the asset editor, which is a new feature in V-Ray 3 for SketchUp, which allows you to easily see, find, and modify all the lights in your scene. So if we look at the toolbar, you'll notice the first few icons are the lights you can easily just drop in, like the plane light, sphere light, spotlight, IES light. Then we have the Omni light and the dome light. And then if you want to convert a mesh, or a group or a component into a light, you could use the mesh light tool. And then there's the adjust light intensity tool, which I'll go over in a second. So I'm going to go ahead and drop a dome light in because I'd like to change the lighting of the scene to use an image instead of the sun and sky in SketchUp. You'll notice right away that this doesn't cancel out the sunlight is still enabled. So if we just go to our list of lights, you'll notice the dome light's listed now. We'll just disable the sunlight. So now the dome light is the only thing lighting the scene. And it uses a texture by default that comes with V-Ray for SketchUp, but I'm going to go ahead and switch this out for a different one. And what I'm going to use is one by an artist known as Peter Guthrie. And there's plenty of free and for sale dome lights available on the internet as well. And you can also disable the texture and use a simple color, which can be nice. Like if you use a gray color, you can create a foggy day or a cloudy day. But I'm just going to use the texture, and I'm going to go ahead and adjust the intensity. Just like we did with the sunlight, you can modify the intensity, make it brighter or darker. And let's say I want to rotate this. There's two ways to do it. The easiest of which is to just go to Options and enable Lock Dome Light. This locks the texture of the dome light with the object in the scene. So if I rotate the object in the scene, it will rotate the texture as well. Then the other way to do this, if you don't want it locked to the object in the scene, you can just go to the texture, go to your UVW, settings on the bottom rollout and just modify the horizontal and vertical rotation. And now let's say I want to add some artificial lights to the scene. There's a series of bollards in the background on the right there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop this render and we'll zoom into those. So this is already a component, and I'm going to go in and there's a group for the outer cover of the light. So what I'm going to do is convert that into a mesh light. So this is now a light source. And if I go to the light settings, you'll notice there's now a V-Ray mesh light listed. So let's go ahead and start an interactive rendering. And these are now emitting light. Now they're a little dark, so I'm going to increase the intensity. And just like with the other lights, you can go in and modify the intensity by typing in a different value. There's also the Adjust Light Intensity tool. And with this, all you need to do is just click on the light and drag, hold the mouse button down and drag up and down to increase and decrease the intensity of the light. And then you can also adjust the color of the light. So if I wanted a much warmer color, it's as simple as just switching out the color. Right, moving on to materials, V-Ray for Sketchup comes with an extensive library of pre-made materials, along with a powerful tool set to customize those materials or create your own unique materials. There are also a powerful set of textures and material layers available to create things like stochastic flakes. You can use V-Ray dirt and curvature to create edgeware, and SSS2 for creating accurate subsurface scattering for materials like skin or transparent plastics or, say, a marble material. So let's go ahead and open the asset editor and show you the material editor. And first off, you have the material preview scene that updates automatically as you make changes. There's also different scenes available within the preview that you can use, and some are more helpful than others depending on the material type you're using or creating. What's next is the material list. This is the list of materials in the scene, which coincides with the material list in SketchUp. You can also create new materials here based on presets, such as the hair material, for example, which I'll go over that a little bit more in a bit. You can import and save VR matte files as well to use for different projects. Then we also have the quick settings. Now this is kind of a simplified version of the material editor that allows you to quickly create different materials based on a collection of presets. Now this is set to generic right now, but you can switch this out to something like glass, for instance, to make a glass material, liquids, metals, car paints, etc. And then if you want more advanced settings, you can expand the right panel. And both the advanced settings and the quick settings are linked to each other as well. And if we expand the left rollout, we have the material library, which you can customize. You can move around the different parts of the editor. I'm going to go ahead and start an interactive rendering, and I'm going to start applying materials to this scene from the library. This is very simple to do. Like, I can select a couple pieces of the model. Like, I'm going to go with the bottom of the table. I'm going to add a wood material to that. So I'm going to use this dark wood material, just drag it into my material list, right-click on the material and apply material to selection. You can also do this by layer as well. And this is just a way that you can do this using the material editor. You can also add the materials to the scene and use the paint bucket tool inside of SketchUp to do this as well. I'm adding some plastics and some metals for the laptop. It's very quick and easy. And you also notice, like with this wood material, for example, there's a size indicator next to the title. So this is easy if you'd like to just, it's kind of a reference of what might be the best size for the material once you put it in your scene. It's like 250 centimeters. If you make it 250 by 250 centimeters in the scene, it'll probably look right. So I'm going to go ahead and now I'm going to use a brick material for the wall in the background. Probably use a painted brick material. And all of these come in as the default size in SketchUp, which if you use feet and inches is 10 inches by 10 inches. But this is too small, so what I want to do is make it larger. Now you could do that by modifying each texture inside the editor, but the easiest thing to do is just use what's built in the SketchUp and change the size in the material editor in SketchUp. So let's make this, let's try 50 by 50 centimeters, which is still too small. Instead we'll do 100 by 100 centimeters. Okay, next I'm going to apply a porcelain material to these cups. Then let's say I don't like this orange color. It's easy to just go into the quick settings. I'll modify the color to something else. Then any changes you make to scene materials do not affect your material library. Just think of it as your material library being read-only. You drag in a copy into your scene, and then you can modify it as much as you want without worrying about changing the materials in the library. Okay, moving on to geometry. V-Ray for SketchUp has many features that help you deal with complex geometries in a fast and efficient manner. We have proxies, which allow you to insert complex geometry into a scene without bogging down your SketchUp model. V-Ray Fur gives you the power to easily create fur, grass, and carpet in your scene without bogging down your SketchUp model with extra geometry. Finally, the V-Ray Clipper is a powerful tool that allows you to dynamically cut your geometry using either the section planes built into SketchUp or your own unique geometry. So let's go over proxies first. As you can see, we already have proxies in this scene. In SketchUp, they just appear as these basic shapes and triangles, but in the rendering, you'll notice that it's actually really complex geometry. And this is great for things like plants and trees, people, etc., that you don't want to bog down your SketchUp model with, but you still want to look really nice when you hit render. And you can make these in SketchUp, and you can also generate them from almost any other application with V-Ray, such as Max, Rhino, and Maya. And next, let's go ahead and show V-Ray fur by creating a rug in this scene. I'm going to go ahead and create a piece of geometry first. I'm going to make it a group. Then I'm going to apply V-Ray fur to the object. You'll notice right away it updates and it uses the material that's applied to the base object, which right now is just the kind of generic default material in Sketchup. So I'm going to replace this with the grass material we have, just to show you how easy it is to create grass. Now, any material will work with fur, but it's usually best, or it's more optimized, I should say, to use a hair material, but anything will work. So I'm going to go ahead and, since we're making a rug, I'm going to apply a carpet material. And the default settings for V-Ray fur in SketchUp are made to look like grass, but we're going to replace these with some, we're going to modify these a little bit to make this look more like a rug. And the name for these, it's pretty much self-explanatory. So if I decrease the length amount, it will get shorter. I decrease the thickness, it'll get thinner. Bend amount will increase to make the bits of fur bend more. Now there's also more advanced settings too, like if you'd like to make grass that comes in patches, you can use texture, for example, to make certain areas thicker and certain areas thinner. I'm modifying the curl amount right now to make the grass curl a little bit more. Taper amount, etc. You can see it's very easy to just create simple shag carpeting, grass, etc. And finally, we have the V-Ray clipper. So let's start out by using just a section plane that's built into SketchUp. You'll notice, and by default, it will use a material, whatever material is applied to the object, as the cut material. So it won't leave spaces hollow. Then we can also do things like if I go to the settings, I can enable and disable it, and it will enable and disable it in V-Ray and SketchUp at the same time. You can enable and disable effect lights, meaning that the lights will act as though the object isn't being cut, so objects with no light will be black. And you can also disable use object material. This will change the cut material to be a solid black material, or you can use any material in your material library to replace this with. So I'm going to use this red material. You'll notice that now all the cut materials are this red. Now if I don't want this to be just a simple cut plane, I can use any geometry as long as it's in a group or component to cut the model instead. So I'm going to delete the section plane. And I have hidden this it's kind of a pie slice of an ellipsoid here. And in the geometry toolbar, there's a button called Mesh Clipper. We're going to use that to make this a piece of geometry that will cut the model. And as you can see, it's just like the section plane, all the same settings. So like I can disable the object material and use my own material just like the section plane. Then next I have an example of a final rendering that we did where we used kind of a stepped piece of geometry to cut the model in kind of a unique, fun way. And up next we have render elements. Render elements allow you to export individual elements of the render for advanced compositing and third-party applications like Photoshop, for example. But we also have a new feature in V-Ray for SketchUp 3 is the extra texture. This allows you to create a unique texture to use in compositing software. And finally, there's the denoiser, which is a new feature in version 3 that will intelligently remove noise from your final image and allows you to render using less time. And then V-Ray has several tools for advanced post-processing built right in. And the frame buffer color corrections are powerful tools that allow you to do simple post-processing similar to third-party applications like Photoshop. This way you don't necessarily need to modify your image in those applications when your rendering is complete. And you can even modify these while it's still rendering without reducing your rendering time. Or, I'm sorry, increasing your rendering time. And then lens effects are powerful bloom and glare tools available right in the frame buffer. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and expand the advanced settings and show you the render elements. I'm going to start with what you would typically use for compositing. So I'm simply just finding these and adding them so that they will render out when I render the next image. So global illumination, lighting, reflection, refraction, and self-illumination are typically what you would need to do some compositing. You can also do background if you want the background to come with it as well. I'm also going to use extra text like I explained before, and this allows me to use a texture. Think of it as like a secondary rendering that just renders out this texture. And this is useful, extremely useful for post-processing. And then going back to the extra text, it is, what I did was I used a dirt texture. That way I can kind of enhance some of the details with darker corners that I could apply in something like Photoshop. And then with Z-depth is very useful because you can render out essentially like a height map from the camera. So anything that's closer to the camera will appear white, and anything farther away, I have this set to 5,000. Anything that's 5,000 away will be blacker, which I believe this is set to meters, but it might be centimeters. And then finally the denoiser. You can see there's plenty of settings you can change, but the default is usually fine. And I'm going to go ahead and enable progressive, change my quality to low, and hit render. And so while this is rendering, I don't need to wait till it's done to adjust some of my post-processing effects. I just go to corrections controls. Similar to something like Photoshop, I have plenty of control available, such as hue saturation. I can desaturate it completely to make a black and white image. I can modify the color curves. Now while I'm doing this, the image is still rendering, and these are effects applied on top of the rendering. So as long as it's still in the frame buffer, this is non-destructive to the original final output. And there's also exposure control, which is more of a post-processing exposure. You typically want to have the exposure set in your camera settings, at least close to your final exposure before rendering. And I'm changing color balance. It's kind of an artistic thing that I typically want to do, is make the shadows a little cooler, the highlights a little warmer. All right, the rendering is finished, so I'll go over some of the render elements that rendered out with it. So the RGB color is the raw render. If I switch this to alpha, this is everything that's solid is white and anything that's missing is black. Then we have things like refraction, refractions, self-illumination, etc. And these, you can export all of these out to composite in Photoshop. And again, this is kind of, it's more of an advanced workflow. Also the extra text channel, which you can see this is just the V-Ray dirt texture that I created. You can use that in the post-processing as well, or the compositing, I'm sorry. And then Z-depth, you can see anything that was, I believe it's 5,000 centimeters away from the camera is black, and anything that's, as the objects get closer, they turn white. Then finally the denoiser pass. You can see as I switch from RGB color, which is essentially the raw render, and if I switch to denoiser, the noise is effectively removed from the rendering. Okay, moving on to lens effects. If you click on the last button in the bottom of the frame buffer, this brings up the lens effects, which allows you to change things like the bloom and glare effects, which you'll notice as I increase the effect that areas that are brighter have the kind of bloom effect around them. And the same with the glare effects. Right, and then something for the visualization specialists out there. We've implemented kind of a new pipeline to get from software such as Sketchup or Revit or Rhino straight into 3D Studio Max using with the ability to export VR scenes and import them into Max. Now I'll go ahead and demonstrate this. We've always had the ability to export from Sketchup. But it's as easy as just going through the menu, exporting the VR scene, hitting save, and then in 3D Studio Max, you'll be able to import it. Now this is a scene where I already have a camera and a sunlight set up. So if I just go to my objects and place a V-Ray object using the V-Ray scene, you can then just navigate to that VR scene that I just exported. And this works similar to proxies, and our aim is to also get this ability to import also in SketchUp and Rhino as well. And it brings it in, and it brings in all of your materials, your geometry, even your V-Ray fur that we applied to the carpet. All right, and those of you familiar with our previous licensing system, I have some good news. We've changed from dongle licensing to online licensing. It's designed so you can use a online login to access your V-Ray licenses, and you can even check out those licenses for offline use as well. And when you purchase a workstation license, you receive a render node license with that, which can be used to render from other platforms, such as from Rhino or Revit using Swarm. And then the pricing available for V-Ray for SketchUp. I'd recommend contacting Microsol for more information on monthly and yearly rentals, as well as special bundle offers and any other questions. And I encourage you to go to chaosgroup.com to sign up for a free, fully unlocked 30-day trial of V-Ray for SketchUp or Rhino or Revit or etc. And then I also highly recommend you check out our documentation pages and YouTube channel for more helpful information on using V-Ray.